So here we go, Chapter 20, the digestive system. Before we get started, just to consider the function of the GI or digestive system is we ingest, break things down so that they can be used for nutrients, and then the waste products get eliminated. But there's a lot of processes that are going on in between the in and the organs of the digestive system on this slide. Starting at the very top, we have the salivary glands, which are considered part of accessory organs. The GI organs generally is talking about mouth and all the way down to the anus. So salivary glands are part of accessory organs to kind of assist the GI system in working. And we have the oral cavity, the teeth, the tongue, the pharynx or throat, the epiglottis, the esophagus down to the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and to the anus. And then we have accessory organs of the liver, pancreas, and gallbladder. If we look at the tube that starts, goes throughout the whole GI system, we see a number of layers. And looking at this slide, you can see that you have the, starting with innermost, we'll talk about the mucosa, and then the submucosa, the muscularis, and then the serosa. Talk about it in that order. So when we look at the mucosa, it's the layer that is the inside, so it's open to the lumen, and it has the innermost layer, a layer of epithelium, and then you have a small layer of smooth muscle and connective tissue. In the submucosa is where you see glands, blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. That right there just reminds me of the epidermis and the dermis for some reason. I don't know if that makes sense. But the mucosa, it has more than one layer, including connective tissue, muscle. And the submucosa is where the glands, blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves are found. The muscularis is 2 layers. You could see it there. The muscularis has a layer that goes circularly around the tube, and then you have another layer of muscle that's longitudinally, lengthwise. So it's the interaction between these 2 layers of muscles that we have contraction and relaxation and movement of food through the GI tract. The outermost layer is the serosa, and this is what covers the GI tract. The only difference in layers of the tissue layers in the digestive tract where it might be different is at the esophagus and at the rectum. So instead of it being called serosa, it's adventitia is the outermost layer. If you notice on the right-hand side, we have enteric nervous system, and there's 2 layers, one between the muscle layer and the submucosa, and another layer in between the muscle layers. And that's the innervation of the GI tract. The description of the enteric nervous system is on page 391. Pretty interesting that 100 million neurons, that's amazing. It's part of the autonomic nervous system, and so under the influence of parasympathetic, we know what happens, and sympathetic, we know what happens. and it communicates with the central nervous system. Interesting that as a result of, communicates with the central nervous system, but if there was a disconnect, that the enteric nervous system would continue to work independently. So if we continue to go through the GI tract, this is the peritoneum, which is the serous membrane in the abdominal cavity. And you see, to me, this reminds me of like drapes. You have the bowels that are attached by a visceral peritoneum that kind of anchors them in place, but allows them to it allows them to kind of like hang down like a drape would. You think that when they open up the abdomen, they take out this long tube of bowel, and it's not so, because it's all connected by this mesentery. In the mesentery, you'll have blood vessels and lymph nodes, and nerves. This is a sagittal view, and we're looking at this hollowness of the stomach, and then the different parts of the colon, which we'll talk about when we get there. The greater and lesser omentum are the greater omentum here is kind of like a curtain that hangs down. It's part of the mesentery that hangs down over the bowel. And the lesser omentum is found above on the superior aspect of the stomach, inferior. And you can tell this looks like it has a lot of fat in it. The next slide, the layer of the GI tract that contracts and relaxes to propel food. We're thinking about muscle layer. That's the longitudinal and circular muscularis. That's B. And I was right. How about? We're going to head back up to the opening to the GI system, the mouth. Has a lot of things in there that we'll talk about. Starting with the lips, you have an upper and lower lip. You have the tongue, the teeth, the palate, the uvula. So the teeth we'll describe a little bit more in detail, but attached into the bone and the hard palate, which is part of the facial bones. And behind the hard palate is the soft palate with the uvula hanging down. Excuse me, when you swallow, the uvula rises up to close off the nasopharynx, or the opening from the nose. And we assess the uvula when we ask somebody to say, does that soft palate and uvula rise? The tongue is a skeletal muscle, and it's attached to the floor of the mouth by the lingual frenulum. You could just say frenulum. It's a piece of mucous membrane that sometimes children are born where it's too tight, and they'll say that they're tongue-tied, and it could affect speech, so they'll actually cut it. The hard palate, we know, is made up of from the maxilla, and you'll see that there's openings from the salivary glands, duct openings that will release saliva into the oral cavity. So it's actually in the mouth where we start having some mechanical as well as chemical digestion occurring. So mechanical digestion is that breaking down of larger pieces of food into smaller pieces So that's with our teeth, and our tongue kind of will move things around for positioning. And chemical digestion is in the saliva that gets put into the oral cavity from the salivary glands, contains enzymes, one of them being salivary amylase, which is used to start the breakdown of um, sugars and starches. So here's a picture of the salivary glands, where their function is to produce, secrete saliva. And just like lots of the other fluids in our body, saliva is mostly water, but in the fluid is enzymes, and there are some that have antibacterial compounds, and some the digestive enzymes, as I mentioned, salivary amylase and lipase. So lipase begins a digestion or breakdown of fats, and salivary amylase breaks down starches. So the location of the salivary glands are, the parotid gland is anterior to the ear, and submandibular, exactly what it says, under the mandible, sublingual under the tongue, and again, they have the ducts that will bring the saliva into the oral cavity. We know that saliva can be triggered just when we start thinking about food. There was that Pavlovian experiment done where the bell rang, the dog got food, and the next time the bell rings, the dog starts salivating, thinking that it's going to get food. So just thinking about food can trigger the release of saliva. Here's a picture of the teeth, and we have deciduous teeth, which are teeth that fall out, and or our baby teeth, and then we have our adult teeth. And this picture here will describe when the adult teeth come in. So the wisdom teeth in the back, between 17 and 25, makes sense. That's when people are getting their wisdom teeth removed. And you start seeing the adult teeth of these front ones. These are usually the first to come in, as well as as a baby, as well as the first to come in as an adult. So if we look at the ones in the front, those are called incisors, and incisors assist us in cutting our food. And the canines, the two canine teeth, pointier, will assist in us being able to tear our food. And then our premolars and molars are for grinding. And you should know them. I'm not going to ask you how many. I'm not going to ask you any of that. But you should know the function of each of those types of teeth. All right, so let's look at the structure of the tooth. And if you look at the top, starting with the crown, like the crown on your head, that is made up of enamel, which is a very, very hard substance. And the enamel covers dentin. Dentin is, as you can see, there's a large area of dentin in the tooth. So the first part, the enamel covered, this is the part that sticks out of our gum line, is the crown. Then we have the neck, and then below the gum line is the root. I think it's interesting that down at the bottom, it kind of reminds me of a hair follicle where you have blood supply. In this case, you also have nerves. So this is the root canal, where you can have an infection or inflammation there, and they'll have to drill down and remove the blood vessels and nerves. Getting a root canal is painful, but an infection there is also very painful. So pretty interesting that dentin and cementum, which is out here, can regenerate, but enamel cannot. This is this hard substance that we get assessed for caries or cavities. And because it's unable to regenerate, we need to keep repairing it. And so filling the holes, filling those cavities. Each tooth is embedded in the bone, and there are ligaments that will help keep the tooth in place. We call this the socket. Okay. So which enzyme acts in the mouth to begin the breakdown of starch? That would be amylase. Amylase is the enzyme that begins to break down starch. Then we'll see those other ones. Pepsin is in the stomach, and trypsin, duodenum. This slide is showing how a bolus of food travels through the GI system. So starting with the ingestion of food, we chew it, and saliva helps moisten it. Our tongue will kind of like package it up as what we call a bolus, and then it gets pushed to the back of the mouth, and then we swallow. So when we swallow, the soft palate covers the nasopharynx, and the epiglottis will cover the trachea, so that food or liquid that's being swallowed doesn't enter into the airway. So if you notice, the esophagus sits behind the trachea. The trachea is more interior. I mentioned a couple times that the trachea has a C-shaped cartilage anteriorly, and it doesn't have any cartilage posteriorly. And one of the benefits of that is if we're swallowing something, the esophagus will expand, and sometimes if you take too big of a bite or something, it might project into the trachea. But the esophagus is actually pretty small when something's not passing through it. This picture here is the esophagus. The esophagus runs about 10 inches in length to below the diaphragm, where it meets up with the stomach. And there's a sphincter, or a round muscle that will open the allow food that's being swallowed to enter into the stomach. It's that lower esophageal sphincter that contributes to GERD. When that's weakened and gastric contents spray backwards, can burn the lower area of the esophagus. So it's a complicated, I guess sort of complicated process when we swallow, which kind of is exemplified when you have a stroke patient or something that has lost the ability to swallow, and all the effort that it takes to gain some of that back. There's a large coordination of muscles in order to swallow. There's enzymes that get secreted to or mucus that gets secreted to moisten our food, and muscles that are contracting and relaxing and pushing that food through the esophagus down to the stomach. So the peristalsis that you probably have heard about with our bowels is exhibited also in the esophagus, a wave-like forward motion of the of food. So the next structure that we talk about is the stomach. And the stomach has, of course, numerous areas. The cardiac region is about where that lower esophageal sphincter is. And so when somebody has heartburn, the heart is not too far away, but it's on the other side of the diaphragm. But it's called the cardiac or cardia region. Next, uppermost, you have the fundus. Sometimes the people that have hiatal hernias need a surgery where they take the fundus and wrap it around here to keep the stomach from protruding back up into the thoracic cavity. The main part of the stomach, number 3, is the body. And then we have a funnel-shaped region called the pylorus. The pylorus is right before we get to the small intestine. And so we have a sphincter on the way in, and we have a sphincter on the way out. The pyloric sphincter will control the release of what's now called chyme. Once food enters into the stomach and the enzymes work on it, it becomes this milky substance, and that when the pyloric sphincter will control how much of that chyme enters into the duodenum next. This duodenum right here is a C-shaped. This is the first part of the small intestine. On page 395, there's a great body at work talking about how what happens in the stomach. There's some digestion that occurs of protein and small amount of starch and fats. But most of the absorption of nutrients takes place in the intestine. And alcohol is absorbed in the small intestine as well, but the absorption is affected by how quickly the stomach empties its contents. So that's why people will eat before consuming alcohol, because it'll slow down the effects. So the stomach has the same amount of layers, the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. But the only difference is in the muscle layer, the muscularis layer, there's actually 3 muscle directions. You still have the longitudinal, you still have the circular, but now you have an oblique, which is really it's like at an angle. And the whole benefit of this is that it can, cause that churning, that mixing in the stomach that's necessary. You have also rugae, just like we saw in the urinary system. The stomach can expand to accommodate a larger volume. And we, extreme eaters will kind of test the limits there. So if we look at the gastric mucosa, this next slide actually is talking about the gastric mucosa. And it's enlarged to show this gastric pit, where you have different cells there that have different functions. And we'll start with the mucus cells. Makes sense that those are the ones that make mucus. The parietal cells' job is hydrochloric acid as well as intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is necessary for B12 absorption, and B12 we know is necessary for blood cell formation as well as nervous system. So it's important. And chief cells that are also found in this gastric pit are responsible for the digestive enzymes, like pepsinogen is one of them. So there's also in the bottom of these gastric pits enteroendocrine glands. And enteroendocrine glands are those that produce hormones. One, gastrin, which we'll talk about at length, and two, ghrelin. So one of the things with ghrelin is that it triggers the part of the brain responsible for hunger, like the hypothalamus, to increase appetite. Very interesting. One thing that always comes up somewhere in nursing school is how long does it take to have something pass through the stomach? And the fast fact on page 396 addresses that, in that it empties less than 4 hours following a liquid meal and may take 6 hours following a meal that's high in fat. Interesting. The gastric juice contains the mucus from the mucus cells, hydrochloric acid from the parietal cells, and the enzymes from the chief cells. And the fast fact on the same page saying that the gastric glands produce 3 liters of gastric juice each day. Ay, ay, ay. So this slide, the question, what is the purpose of rugae? And that is to allow the stomach to expand. All right, now we are going to talk about the movement of chyme, starting from when we have food enter into the stomach. The stomach is going to release those gastric juice components, and our food is going to get mixed up in with the gastric juices. All the while moving forward in the GI tract, like going the next structure. So in the case from the stomach, it goes to the small intestine. So when the food has been beginning to be broken down in the mouth and then some continuation in the stomach, it becomes this fluid, and that it's now called chyme. It says chyme. It looks like you might want to say chime, but it's really chyme. And what we have is contraction of the muscles of the stomach, that you have the pyloric sphincter will open and only allow a small amount, 30 mLs of chyme, to exit into the duodenum. Before we start talking about the accessory organ of the liver, one of the interesting things is what the 3 phases of gastric secretions. And the first phase is the cephalic phase. Cephalic, think head. And this is when we think or smell or taste food. What happens is the SLUD, the autonomic system, parasympathetic, will trigger the stomach to release gastric acid, gastric juices, as well as the hormone gastrin. What gastrin does is stimulates more gastric secretion. The second phase is the gastric phase, and that's when food gets into the stomach. As food stretches the muscles of the stomach, that it triggers nerves reflex that causes more gastrin to be secreted and from the endocrine cells, as well as increased gastric juice from the parietal cell, hydrochloric acid, parietal cell, the intrinsic factor of mucus, your chief cells. So all of that is then triggered by gastrin, to hormone. So then we have the intestinal phase, is when the contents have left the stomach and go into the duodenum, and it's a duodenum that gives feedback to the stomach to say, okay, we don't need gastrin, we don't need more increasing of gastric secretions, and the food has left the stomach, is in the small intestine, so gastrin would just continue to be released in the stomach and can cause major problems. Peptic ulcers on the bottom of 397 is ulceration where it can actually perforate or break through the layers of the stomach. It could be the stomach or the duodenum generally. So you can have if the erosion goes through to a layer where there's highly vascularized, you could have somebody bleed out essentially from a peptic ulcer. Big contributing factor for peptic ulcers is H. pylori, a bacteria. So the bacteria will trigger a irritation of the lining of the stomach or the duodenum. So it's an inflammatory response. So when somebody, and we'll learn about this in pharm, but when somebody has a peptic ulcer, the treatment's going to include antibiotics. It's H. pylori, the #1 cause of peptic ulcers is a bacteria. So treating with antibiotics makes sense. Generally, we talk about the liver as the right upper quadrant, but as you could see in this picture, it crosses the midline, it crosses the sternum. So there is a piece of the liver that actually is on the left side, but generally we consider right upper quadrant. The liver is very busy, has lots of jobs, and you should know some of them between pharm and this class. So there's some developing of proteins, some of the plasma proteins, the clotting factors. We know that glycogen is stored in the liver. It's from glucose. We know that the metabolism of drugs occurs in the liver. There are a right and left lobe separated by this ligament, and I won't be asking you really more than that. So this is the view of the underside of the liver, where you see the green structure is the gallbladder. So it's close proximity to the liver, interestingly, because it's the liver where bile is formed and it's sent to the gallbladder for storage. You also have two ways that blood is brought to the liver. One, off of the aorta, you have the hepatic artery. And then two, from the digestive system, you have the hepatic portal vein, where blood is brought from the GI system to the liver and then returns into circulation. So this slide is showing us the way that the liver is set up to accept blood from the digestive system via the portal vein. So that's got a lot of the nutrients or medications that we're taking PO are in the portal vein brought to the liver through here. The hepatic artery comes off the aorta, so it's coming off the left side of the heart, the aorta, the abdominal aorta, enters to the liver, and so now I have oxygen-rich blood and nutrient-rich blood, both coming into the liver, where it passes through cells, sinusoids that will remove any toxins and any of the drugs. This is where that first pass effect occurs. We know that there's another job of the liver to make those clotting factors and like albumin and angiotensinogen and the glucose from glycogen to the bloodstream. So all of that is getting done in the liver. The central vein is where blood that's been processed gets returned to the circulatory system, out of the liver into the circulatory system. The canaliculi here is how cells in the liver that make bile gets transported via the hepatic ducts over to the gallbladder. We also have cells in the liver that are phagocytic. They will help break down the damaged red blood cells and remove any debris that's passing. So what liver structure filters blood to remove nutrients as well as toxins? Well, this is for the bile. These are the cells of the liver. Sinusoids is your answer. The gallbladder. The gallbladder is underneath the liver. It's usually represented in green, and it's about the size of your thumb, 3 to 4 inches or so, and holds about an ounce plus of bile. So bile leaves from the liver via the hepatic ducts and then will converge into the common hepatic duct, which goes to the common bile duct, over to the liver through the cystic duct. So here we go from the liver to the right and left hepatic ducts, to the common hepatic duct, the cystic duct, over to the gallbladder, and you have the common bile duct. From the gallbladder will head down and be bile be secreted into the duodenum. So if somebody had their gallbladder out, they'll probably snip it right about here or so. And so the liver is still making bile, and it goes directly down into the duodenum. There's not a storage place for it anymore. So I'm not going to ask you about the sphincters. You might see that when we do GI in semester 3, a little bit more information about these sphincters and the papilla. The one function of the gallbladder is to concentrate the bile, so that concentration it dehydrates kind of. So as a result, that's how stones are formed. A big component of bile is cholesterol. So you'll find a lot of gallstones are cholesterol based. The person that has gallstones will complain of, or inflamed gallbladder will complain of right upper quadrant pain that often will radiate around to the back. The issue is if the gallstone blocks the flow of bile and it backs up and then gets inflamed, or it might have come down into the common bile duct and blocks the flow down to the duodenum, and that could present major problems. It could back up. Person with gallstones is going to possibly need surgery to remove the gallbladder, but they also can do surgery to remove the gallbladder, or medications to break down the stones. The pancreas, which sits in the C of the duodenum, the head sits in the C, and you have the tail that kind of falls out over the under the stomach. And we talked about the pancreas having both endocrine function and exocrine function. Endocrine-wise, we mentioned last lecture about insulin and glucagon controlling blood glucose. Exocrine function of the pancreas is pancreatic juice. 1.5 liters of pancreatic juice gets put into the duodenum every day. So in the in the pancreatic juice, you have enzymes, and it's pretty easy to remember. Usually it's like carbohydrates for carbs, proteinase for proteins, nuclease for nucleic acids, lipase for fats, lipids. So in addition to those enzymes, you also have a base, a buffer that will help with the strongly acidic chyme that has entered into the duodenum. So the cells of the pancreas that secrete the enzymes are the acinar cells of the pancreas. Remember, we have the beta cells and the alpha cells, and then we have the acinar cells, and the acinar cells is what produces the digestive enzymes. So those enzymes from the pancreas enter into the duodenum from a duct. So hormones go into the bloodstream, and the enzymes go through a duct into the duodenum, right about there. Same place where the bile enters into the duodenum. On the bottom of page 401, it's pretty interesting, hormones and the influence on the digestive system, starting with cholecystokinin, or CCK. When chyme leaves the stomach and enters into the duodenum secretes a hormone, CCK, and CCK causes the gallbladder to contract, causes bile to leave the gallbladder and go into the duodenum, as well as stimulates the pancreas to release its enzymes. So interesting that it continues along hormonally, so we have multiple systems working together. Another hormone is gastrin, which is found in the stomach. We saw that already, where it triggers the increased secretions of gastric juice. But in the duodenum, what it does is it causes the gallbladder to contract as well as pancreatic enzyme secretion. CCK is more powerful than gastrin. Interesting that a test to see how the gallbladder is functioning is they give a person CCK to see what happens when the gallbladder is triggered. Is it totally blocked? Because you should be able to see the bile flowing out. And when somebody's got a blocked gallbladder, there's not going to be any evidence of bile. Secretin is another hormone that is released from the duodenum when chyme enters it, and it causes bile and pancreatic bile to come from the gallbladder and pancreatic ducts. Are you kidding me?
What? Battery?
Oh, sorry about that. I thought I lost my my recording. I didn't even know where to start all over again. But I think secretin was where I was, and that is released from the duodenum and causes the pancreas to release bicarbonate, which is your buffer. So it secretes the enzymes that help break down food, the chyme. This slide is the small intestine. So the first part is the duodenum, and that's represented in green. It's C-shaped. It's the smallest part. It's only about 10 inches or so. And what we have, it starts at the pyloric valve, which is the exit of the stomach, and ends when it mates up with the jejunum. The way I remember the parts of the small intestines is Dow Jones Industrial, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Notice ileum is spelled different than the bone ileum. So the duodenum is where those enzymes and bile enters, and then we also have the jejunum, which is pretty long at 8 feet. It has folds and microvilli that increases the surface area, allows for nutrient absorption. Most of the absorption of nutrients in our body is occurring in the small intestine. The last section of the small intestine is called the ileum, I-L-E-U-M. It's about 12 feet long. It's smaller and less blood flow than the other parts, and has Peyer's patches or lymph tissue in it. When we think about the small intestine, thinking about like somebody that has a colostomy, and so you could have an ileostomy, and at that point what's being produced or what's being eliminated through the ileostomy is going to be fairly liquidy compared to a colostomy that's, say, from the descending colon over here on the left side, or even the ascending is going to be more. So the ileum begins at the end of the jejunum and ends at the beginning of the large intestine at the cecum. So you have the ileocecal valve. And two ways that we have food moving along in the stomach is by segmentation and peristalsis. So segmentation, you have this breaking up into sections, the small intestine, where there's contraction, relaxation, and breaking up of the food. And then you have peristalsis, where it's moving in one direction, moving towards the end. This is what we are listening for. We hear the gurgling representing peristalsis. So this question is asking, what is the purpose of the gallbladder? It doesn't produce bile. Bile is produced in the liver, but it does store the bile. So we saw this already where we have the serosa, muscularis, submucosa, and mucosa on the way in. This is from out to in. And then we have these folds, circular folds, like rings almost. But the next slide is going to show us the villi and microvilli that increase the, this is the villi and microvilli that increase the surface area that allow for increased absorption. So the microvilli on top of each cell, and the villi are just like a shag carpet, but each thread of that shag carpet, or the villi, has a blood vessel, both arterial and venous, as well as a lymph vessel. And if you go back to our lymph lecture, you remember that the one function of the lymph is to absorb lipids, and that is what's the job of this, what's called a lacteal in the GI system. It's a lymph vessel in a villi. So in these villi, we have goblet cells, and the goblet cells are secreting mucus, and the epithelial that has the microvilli. Remember that as nutrients, drugs, or whatever are absorbed through the small intestine and absorbed into the bloodstream, it first goes to the liver via the hepatic portal system before it goes into the regular circulatory system. It goes via the hepatic portal system. So, chemical digestion and absorption, there's enzymes that we talked about, amylase, carbohydrates, proteinase, and what happens via chemical digestion is that food particles are broken down into smaller and smaller pieces that can then be absorbed in the small intestine. So carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth by the enzyme salivary amylase, and then continues in the small intestine with pancreatic amylase. And the villi, we saw the villi, there's enzymes sucrase, lactase, and maltase. Sucrase breaks down sucrose, lactase breaks down lactose, maltase breaks down maltose. So that's in the microvilli. So the last part of carbohydrate digestion is occurring in that's the small intestine. Protein digestion begins in the stomach with pepsin. Pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid makes pepsin and helps break down proteins. In the duodenum, trypsin and chymotrypsin are the enzymes that come from the pancreas and will continue breaking down proteins. And then in the small intestine, you have peptidases, same place in that brush border. You have peptidases that break down the proteins into their amino acids where they get absorbed to be used again. Fats first are going to need to be broken down. Like if you think of oil and water and you add soap to that and shake it up, it kind of breaks up that fat. That's emulsification. And that's done with bile. Bile is what helps emulsify fats and breaks down into smaller droplets. And the pancreas, the lipase, helps continue to break. I was finishing up lipase, but I can't figure out how to get back to the other slide. But you have pancreas. Fat starts getting broken down in the small intestine by under the influence of bile, and then under the influence of pancreatic lipase continues to be broken down. And then glycerol and fatty acids are absorbed into the lacteals in the villi of the small intestine, get absorbed and travel in through the lymph system till it gets back up to where lymph fluid enters back into the cardiovascular system. All right, so this slide is telling us about the large intestine, beginning where the ileum meets the cecum, or the first part of the large intestine. You notice the appendix is branches off of the cecum. It is used to be thought that it was not a necessary thing and we could live without it for sure, but there is lymph tissue there, so it does serve a purpose. So the parts of the large intestine include the cecum, ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid, and then the rectum, and then the anal canal. In the large intestine is where most of the water is absorbed. Most of the nutrients are absorbed through the small intestine, and most water is absorbed through the large intestine. All right, some interesting things like the appendix, appendicitis, and what that symptoms are, right? Lower quadrant, pain. Stool is a commonly done surgery. And then the body at work, talking about and gas and bacterial flora. We have normal organisms in our gut that help break things down, contribute to production of vitamins like vitamin K and some B vitamins. So pretty cool stuff happening there. Just like we have a internal and external sphincter in the bladder that we talked about, we have an internal and external sphincter in our anal sphincters. And again, it's the external sphincter that we gain control over. Usually, 2, 3 years old, there's control of our bowels. Some of the changes with aging are listed on the bottom of 407, which are interesting. The muscle wall weakens and peristalsis slows, so constipation and hemorrhoids can occur. And those of you that work long-term care know that there's many people that become bowel obsessed. Nutrition can be impacted by teeth that are decaying, as well as decreased taste and smell, so decreased appetite. So we need to be alert to that. And there could be a change in the absorption of nutrients. If you have decreased production of your gastric enzymes, we need B12 to help absorb, B12 for blood cell formation, but we need intrinsic factor in order to absorb B12, and that comes from the parietal cells. So if we have decreased production by these cells in the stomach, that can affect a lot of things, including blood cell formation. There's a nice summary on page 407 in the middle about the different enzymes and what substances and where they're being absorbed. This question, most nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine, is the only answer. Water in the large intestine. So the faster food moves through the large intestine, the more liquid it's going to be, diarrhea. So the longer it takes to pass through, the drier it's going to be, and that's going to be constipation. So treating those, you probably hinted at that in 105 already. We'll talk about it in GI in semester 2. But so most nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine. So if you look at that box on 407, it kind of shows what enzymes are being produced and what substance they are digesting. So in the case of the stomach, it's pepsin for protein. And in the mouth, we have salivary amylase and lipase that gets started to be digested. Not any absorption is occurring in the mouth.